Hello and welcome to the online launch of the Mutant project by Eben Kirksey. I'm Catherine King, Marketing Manager, and I'm delighted to introduce Professor Sarah Franklin of Christ's College, University of Cambridge, and author Eben Kirksey of Alfred Deakin Institute in Melbourne, Australia. Professor Franklin is one of the world's leading experts on the social aspects of reproductive and genetic technologies, IVF, cloning, embryo research, and stem cells. She's a Wellcome Trust Senior Investigator and Director of the Reproductive Sociology Research Group. Eben Kirksey is an American anthropologist. He's sought out as an expert on science in society and speaks widely at the world's leading academic institutions, music festivals, art exhibits, and community events. Eben will be presenting some information about his book for the first part of the evening, and then Sarah and Eben will be in conversation, and then after that there will be time to answer your questions. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you have any technical issues, please use the chat. Details of how to order Eben's book at 50% discount using the code MUTANT50 will be available in the chat too, and we'll put it there several times in case you miss it at all. I'm now going to hand over to Eben.
So thanks so much for having me. Thanks so much for publishing the book. I'm delighted to see it's already in paperback, and in the UK it's actually affordable. You can get it for about 10 quid, even without the discount. So I'm just going to do a couple of slides here. Let's see if I can bring back the Zoom room. I can't see you, Sarah. Can you see the slides?
Yep, I can see you and I can see the slides.
Okay, well, I'll bring you back at a certain point. But I've got the slides queued up now. So I've just got a few slides to kind of get the conversation started. This is a classic image for people who know about the history of reproductive medicine. This is the birth of Louise Brown with the medical researchers Steptoe and Edwards posing there. Sarah's written about Louise Brown's lifelong struggle, basically to be normal. There was a lot of talk about how IVF was a miracle technology, but in Sarah's work, she's really showed how it's actually pretty banal and comes with some known health risks. At that time, it was very unknown. And the kind of central story in my book about the use of CRISPR-Cas9, a gene editing tool, basically tried to replicate this moment, basically bringing IVF technology together with a new tool for gene editing. So the lab that did this experiment in Shenzhen, China, very much wanted to have a photo like the one of Louise Brown. In fact, during the participant consent process, they explicitly asked the couples, the families, if they could have permission to take their picture, and then they wanted to use it for all kinds of applications, for books, calendars, pictures, charts, the internet, outdoor billboards, even elevators. This is the video that describes the
little
moment.
Chinese girl named Lulu and Lala came crying into the world as healthy as any other babies a few weeks ago.
So that was Dr. Zhanghui He, and he made this announcement actually not when the girls were healthy and with their parents, as he claimed on YouTube, but when they were in the neonatal intensive care unit. These two children, the results of this first CRISPR experiment in reproductive medicine, were born very prematurely at 31 weeks. And in the book, I discuss the health problems that they had at birth, and kind of explore the question: is this the result of unknown problems, that CRISPR introduced, or known problems of IVF? So Dr. He didn't get his picture. Like the parents of the babies, any parents who've had very premature babies know that you can't hold the child. He was anxiously waiting in the hallway along with the parents as the birth. As the birth happened, he was out in the hall, and then, like the parents, he wanted to pick up the children, but couldn't. So he never got his picture. This was a highly controversial experiment, not only in the scientific community, but for the Chinese public. There were elements of the Chinese Communist Party that supported the experiment, and in the first hours as the story broke, you saw some puff pieces go out in official national news outlets. But you also saw the Chinese public and the scientific community in China really push back. And it became a very hotly debated topic. So Weibo is sort of like the Facebook of China. WeChat is a direct messaging app, and you saw everybody talking about this for about a week. It received 1.6 billion views, this particular hashtag, the first case of the gene-edited HIV immune babies. I think the overwhelming sentiment on here was outrage. The public basically was outraged that human children would be treated like experimental animals. And in the book, I go into the motivations of the parents, why they signed up for the trial. But this controversy raged even before the health problems of the babies were known. The health problems are one of the things that I report for the first time in the book. Prior to this book, it was accepted that, Dr. Hu's statement, they were as healthy as any others. But, I kind of go into the complicated ways that as this story emerged, the truth did not initially about their premature birth. Interestingly, the parents who signed up for the study supported Dr. Hu. If you followed the story, you know that he experienced this meteoric rise to fame, followed by a sudden fall of grace. He was eventually imprisoned and sentenced to 3 years in jail. But the parents, a number of them notably wrote letters of support as the government was considering what sort of sanctions and what sort of criminal penalties to bring on him. And for the couples, the desire was simply to have a healthy baby. They were HIV positive, and the book talks a lot about the stigma that they were living with and how the parents weren't really necessarily, HIV is a manageable disease in China, much like the US or the UK. If you take your medicines, you're not going to have a lifespan that's significantly different from normal people. But they saw this experiment as a way to liberate their children from the possible social stigma of this disease. So before we open up a conversation with Sarah, I also want to situate this story in the context of the China dream. So Dr. Hu was a self-made man. He came from a rural village in China. This is a picture of the village, but this is a picture of the village today. When he was born in 1984, they didn't have electricity. This road wasn't built yet. And when he was born, he came out with the umbilical cord wrapped around his neck. The hospital was an hour away walking, and then a long bus ride. And he didn't have his first encounter with modern medicine until he was in primary school. They told me about how all the children were lined up. They were given injections with the same needle. And obviously now we know there's risks of transmitting disease that way. But this was a situation where people were making on order of $100 a year, a very impoverished region of the Hunan province. Dr. Hu later went on, he excelled at school. He went to the US, where he earned a PhD at Rice University in Stanford, very much embedded in the innovation economy of Silicon Valley. But then he was recruited back to China, to Shenzhen, a place across the bay from Hong Kong that very much styles itself as the Silicon Valley of China, a place where ideals about disruptive innovation, about doing things faster than anywhere else on Earth, very much prevail. So the story of the China dream is not only a story that's sort of similar to the American dream about kind of making yourself. It's also a national political project. President Xi announced the China Dream as an official Chinese Communist Party platform with a 2017 speech. He basically called for disruptive innovation. He wanted to see the status quo of Western modernity disrupted by an Asian future. And there's been heavy investments in all sorts of fields, from robotics to drones. Shenzhen is the place that makes computers and smartphones, where likely the devices that we're talking on right now were made in Shenzhen. So this experiment fit a story of innovation and disruption. This is a picture of the hospital that gave Dr. He ethics approval. And part of the book is really an exploration of whose values and ethics are guiding these experiments. It's an inventory of the very complicated values that are at play in contemporary China, but also elsewhere in the world, where we have reproductive medicine basically being governed by a profit-driven enterprise, an enterprise that in academic circles, Sarah and other people have called biocapitalism, sort of the fusion of profit-driven technological innovation, with these market principles that are based on speculation, that are based on orienting science towards the future. This is the campus where Dr. He did his research, and one of the notable things about this campus, there's a lot of notable things. They had massive supercomputing facilities. They were involved in all kinds of AI research. Doing autonomous robotics research, doing all sorts of cutting edge science. But this campus didn't have potable water. The students who lived there either had to boil their water or buy it from a vending machine. So I think, for me, that story shows that science and inequality, innovation and inequality often go hand in hand. So as we're thinking about these disruptive innovations, we need to be thinking about questions related to science and justice. Who are these innovations for? And are they going to further exacerbate inequality? So with that, I'm going to stop sharing. Yay, you've come back, Sarah. Hello.
Hi, Evan. Well, thank you so much, Evan. I have to say, really, really enjoyed reading your book. Very unusual to read an academic book by an anthropologist that's such a page turner. And I was really gripped reading your book. And of course, it is quite a story. It's a very remarkable story for so many reasons, and I can really see the appeal of spending the amount of time you did tracking down the story, which you did in an incredibly comprehensive way, traveling to the village where Dr. Ha was born, traveling to Shenzhen, to the university, traveling to other parts of China where IVF is really taking off, traveling all over the United States, all over Britain, to talk to scientists and entrepreneurs working in this field. And the book is very interesting as well because you have such a strong interest in, as you just said, the cultural values and the narratives and the ambitions, the hopes, the imaginaries that structure the pursuit of CRISPR and the pursuit of what we might call the CRISPR dream or the CRISPR imaginary. You talk to gene hackers who are hacking themselves. You talk to lots of people who are quite critical of the way that biology has become so commodified. You give an amazing account of the fertility industry itself as a kind of harbinger of the intersection of biology, of reproductive biology, and market capitalism, even in China. Your book raises a lot of quite troubling issues. At one level, we could call them ethical issues. There are also sociological issues. There are also political issues, economic issues, and so forth. One of which is the amount of support that Dr. Ha had from a very wide range of people, including his former supervisor at Stanford, his co-author of the article that they submitted to Nature that wasn't published, at Rice, a number of venture capital backers, the Chinese government, not to overlook the Chinese government. And so, he was, and as you say, he was inculcated in a very specific ethos. He was explicitly encouraged to go fast and break things, the Shenzhen motto, and he did. And in a way, he was following Edwards and Steptoe. He read their book, he wanted the picture that you showed at the beginning. because you know the photo with the miracle baby was iconic, and you know became a point of transition. It in my work, I don't so much argue IVF is banal, but I argue that IVF has become an analogy for a very radical technology becoming normalized. And that's why I think it's a very important historical lesson for technologies like CRISPR. So I guess the first question I just wanted to ask you about the book is, you know, you were writing it in the context of COVID, a time when public health has risen exponentially in people's understandings, and in many ways, what we would hope for in a public health literate and savvy world would be a very joined up set of approaches to the relationship between the public and new technology like the new vaccines. And in a way, what you show us in the book is kind of the opposite. It's one of your main concerns in the book is this, you know, very secretive, commercialized world that's being driven forward by a combination of venture capitalist endeavors and governments that want to build profitable industries and whole cities like Shenzhen. So I'm just wondering, did writing this in the context of the COVID pandemic strengthen your sense of what the lesson from gene editing is, that it isn't just about gene editing per se, but it's about the relationship to scientific innovation more generally? I'm just wondering.
Yeah, and in fact, I finished it at a much different moment in the pandemic. So I finished it at a moment where we couldn't get masks. now, you know, we can't get vaccines. But if you remember, you know, like 11 months ago or 10 months ago, in many parts of the world, including the US, where I was at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, even in a place of privilege like that, getting a mask was really difficult. You had to order them online. It took like a month to get there. And, you know, I guess that living that experience, I think, showed me how, again, these questions of equity and kind of medical justice are so core to this CRISPR story. And it's not a story that's exceptional, you know, specific to just Shenzhen. One of the other chapters in the book is in Philadelphia, where Novartis pushed through the very first gene therapy. You know, there's been all kinds of hope and hype about gene therapies for 20 years. You know, we had the human genome sequenced, Bill Clinton famously unveiling a draft of the genome from the White House. And there, in those days, 20 years ago, there was all kinds of speculation about the amazing new medical applications that would be unveiled. Didn't happen right away, but 20 years later, Novartis is working on it. And I end up in a lab where the first CRISPR clinical trial in the States is taking place. This is Carl June's lab at the Perlman Center at Penn Medicine. And the remarkable thing I discovered there was that it was all white people getting these new cutting edge therapies. So they very proudly gave me a tour of the Cancer Survivor Hall of Fame. And this was not for the CRISPR experiment, but for the gene therapy that Novartis later released with a price tag of, you know, about $500,000. And it was all white people except for one family, Nick Wilkins. And I profile Nick's story in the book. His mom is Asian American. Both his parents were accountants, and the story is a story of struggle with insurance agencies, you know, about a struggle to just get the bills paid, the struggle to get in the next clinical trial before the relapse happens again. And also a story that kind of refuses the idiom of cure. So many of these gene therapies are being marketed as one and done. You know, you might pay $400,000 or $2.1 million for spinal muscular atrophy, a new gene therapy from Novartis, But the companies are trying to convince us that, you know, because it's genetics, we can fix it once and then you'll be done. But, you know, Nick's mom, Lisa Wilkins, really convinced me and pushed, like I in the interview, I was like, oh, how does it feel to be in this first, you know, experiment that, you know, is working towards a cure? And she's like, no, we're only a few years out from this experiment. We don't know if he's going to have a remission in a few years. So, you know, the book really tried to prioritize the lived experience of patients who signed up for these first clinical trials, and use those experiences to reflect on some of these broader, you know, political, sociological, ethical questions that you identify. So yeah, living in the pandemic, writing this story, I think it's easy for everyone to see kind of the failings of, of science in the current moment. Although, you know, at the same time, we've produced a vaccine. You know, humanity has produced a vaccine faster than ever before. Now we're living. We might not remember this in a year or two, but you know, now that science has kind of done the job, the logistics, supply chains, the infrastructures, the lasting social and racial and geopolitical inequalities are structuring, you know, who gets this. And when you're talking about treatments that are, you know, upwards of $40,000 for IVF, upwards of $400,000 for some of these gene therapies, you know, this is just going to the elite. The insurance companies aren't paying for it. Some healthcare systems are starting to pay, so that Novartis one in the UK, the NHS is paying for that. But in the US, you're basically paying out of pocket or launching a GoFundMe campaign to see if you can come up with these funds. And you know, Nick's mom asked the doctors, you know, will I have to mortgage my house to participate in this experiment? Like $400,000. It was a scandal a few years ago when there was a new therapy derived for hepatitis, and you know, it was again marketed as one and done, and it was $85,000, and that was controversial, you know, just a few years ago, and now we're in the millions for just a single dose of some of these therapies.
Yeah. Well, the social justice message is such a powerful part of this book, and you know, you bring to the writing of this book an already very well developed sensibility about sexual inequality, racial inequality, international differences, in economic advantage, and you write very passionately about the inequalities that run through all the different aspects of scientific innovation related to this particular field. Is a very powerful part of the book, and it's certainly a very important message. And I hope Alondra Nelson, the sociologist who's just taken up a position in the U.S. White House as part of the president's scientific advisory committee, will be reading your book. She, of course, being someone who has been a sociologist of the new genetics and geneticization and eugenics throughout her career. So
Maybe just on that point, Alondra helped me write this book. So I had the privilege of working with Alondra at the Institute for Advanced Study the year before she joined the White House. So she read this as a manuscript and gave me some incredibly amazing feedback just on the narrative structure. So she helped co-produce this book. So I'm deeply indebted to her.
Yeah, I thought her speech when she was accepting her position it was short. I think it's like 4.5 minutes, but it was just one of the best speeches I've heard about putting science back into society, putting society back into science. I mean, she wasn't talking about COVID per se. She was talking very much, you know, about the history of eugenics and the history of race science in the United States and across the world. And she was talking about social injustice and why science has to be a means of combating that, and why science labs have to reflect, you know, the wider society that they're a part of if they're going to do good science. An argument that's been made by many of our colleagues, including Karis Thompson, whose book Good Science takes up that theme. Anyway, I'm glad to hear she's read it cover to cover, and it does have an incredibly important message going forward. I suppose the question of what will be learned from this experiment is ongoing. And I know there must have been difficult decisions for you about what to keep in the book, what not to keep, what not to put in the book. The writing of the book is an incredibly complicated ethical project. And I just wondered, you've written several books, but this is the first book you've written that's more like a trade book about a science subject. And I was just wondering, what did you learn from writing a book like this? What were some of the things that were particularly difficult about writing this kind of book? And were there things, if you left them out, you might not want to say them publicly on a podcast, but were there things, difficult decisions about what to sort of leave in and what to take out?
Yeah, so some of the difficult decisions related to just kind of cultural and historical context. So as ethnographers, as anthropologists, we're trained to do thick description, to kind of give the reader a real sense of how cultural life and spoken words are playing out in a particular setting. And there's some anecdotes that I would have loved to include, but we're just ran out of space. So one, at the same time I'm investigating this high-tech Shenzhen biotech lab, I learned about the typhoon that basically devastated Shenzhen that same year. And outside of one of the fancy hotels I was staying, I could see a fish farm. And I decided I wanted to get a really different sense of what it was like to live in this city, and talked to a fish farmer and learned about the very complicated histories of land tenure. So like he didn't own the land. It was the previous generation that had migrated from the hinterlands that had become the landlord class. And he showed me on the wall where the floodwaters had come with the typhoon. And halfway through the interview, I needed to use the restroom. And I asked him if I could use his restroom. And he embarrassingly said, I don't have one now. It was destroyed in the typhoon. And he talked about the complicated things that just like these cobbling together of very basic technologies to aerate the water, to feed the fish, but the complicated market dynamics that were undermining this mode of life. So basically that land was slated to be filled in, and there was a new biotech facility nearby, China's National Gene Bank, where they aim to basically collect all of humanity's DNA. And they were building some condos and housing for some, high-end biotech employees. So that whole mode of life was being taken away. So in thinking about the complicated temporality of a city like Shenzhen that aspires to embrace the future itself, there's other modes of life that are alongside that. So, some of those complexities that I would put in for an ethnographic project, the complexities about time and some of the more theoretical dimensions of this, I'm saving that for future articles if I get time to write them. But yeah, I think it really was an exercise in kind of storytelling. And you've read my previous books, and you know that I like to jump around a lot. And I remember in some ways your comments about the last book, Emergent Ecologies, was encouraging me to kind of make more deliberate jumps and kind of lean into the jumps as I'm going across these different places and time and culture and space. And I was keeping that advice in mind as I made the jumps here. I'm jumping from San Francisco, where I'm hanging out with HIV positive activists, to Philadelphia, where these communities of color aren't getting access to the cutting edge treatments, to Hong Kong, to Washington, DC. So whole sort of maintaining narrative continuity as you make those jumps is, for me, one of the challenges. I think as an anthropologist studying multi-sided phenomena, we've been doing this for about 20-25 years, following George Marcus. He tells us to follow the people, or follow the thing, or follow the controversy. So this is what I've been trying to do in a lot of my book projects. But having that hang together in a coherent narrative is one of the things that's challenging. But yeah, with your advice, and I had a wonderful editor at St. Martin's Press, Pranoy, who read it line by line and just it's such a delight to have an editor who reads and edits. So that was actually, you know, a lot of people in the academic conversation are worried, like, are you making compromises when you're entering these other spaces? And you know, Pranoy had read everything from Judith Butler to Haraway to, you know, and he was right there with me as I tried to embed the theory into the narratives.
Yeah, that's interesting because I can easily imagine an entire project just about the lab where Dr. Ha was working in, and even in your photos, you showed the trees with the sort of props. It looked like, I don't know if I was interpreting it correctly, but it looked like the trees were being propped up with poles, which is kind of a fitting analogy for one of the, you know, axioms of IVF, the idea of, you know, giving nature a helping hand. And aquaculture, you know, fish farming is a direct precursor of IVF, and in many ways, you know, crosses over with techniques in developmental biology to take fertilization in hand, as it were. So we can, your book is very sort of rich with parables, almost parable-like, allegory-like images and descriptions, and you are implying a lot of the argument. Although personally, I think the threads, you know, come through very clearly, but a lot of the links are implied rather than made, which I also think is a very skillful way to tell a story because it allows the reader to make the connections. And those can be a variety of different kinds of connections, and different readers will make different connections. But yeah, of course, like you say, you kind of lose the depth when you are moving quickly across so many different sites. But I think, you know, I think a very difficult thing about telling this kind of story is that it's such a sensationalist story. It's very hard to sort of not get caught up in the very power of the narratives that you're trying to write about, like, oh, the monster, you know, the monstrous thing to do, and, you know, shock, you know, he edited the genes, and like, oh my word, you know, it was, you know, known about by all these powerful people who didn't say anything, and now he takes the blame. And I mean, it's got all these different sort of quite sensationalist, very emotive elements, and trying to balance the importance of attending to those without kind of letting those just run the story rather than you is a difficult thing to do. But so I guess maybe an obvious question is that the story is unfinished, um, and in some ways, I think the sort of lessons are very much unfinished as well, because clearly this is an area that's going to go ahead. The IVF and the CRISPR platform will increasingly overlap. They already do. Sort of who's going to make the regulations about that is very unclear at the moment. There's a kind of de facto moratorium, but it's not particularly based on any principles or even agreements. It's just a kind of de facto position. Like, it's not even a consensus. So do you think that's going to last? Do you think that, I'm asking you to speculate, but do you think that there's, with IVF, it was helpful that there was sort of quite a long pause initially as the legislation came together. But in many countries, it wasn't possible to have legislation because it was just too difficult. Do you think that one outcome of this will be a stronger motivation to have some sort of coherent sort of, I don't know what it would be, like international agreement? Or do you think that it's too late, that's not possible?
Yeah, so I think if you look at any major international issue, whether it's, you know, climate change or, you know, issues related to global economic system, it's so difficult to get any kind of binding international agreement. And, you know, there was a lot of talk at these summits that I went to, where these gatherings convened by elite scientists trying to come up with some sort of governance architecture. One anecdote from the first summit, I think sort of is an illustration of how difficult it is going to be to come up with some kind of democratic consensus. So, you know, we were talking in the National Academies of Science in Washington, D.C., about a broad range of issues. You know, there were disabled activists there were patient advocates, there were queer and intersex advocates, there were scholars of science and society, Ruha Benjamin, Karis Thompson, you know, interesting, important people in the room. And then this one guy got up and asked a question saying that he represented something like 280 companies, that he was a lobbyist, and that he hoped that the regulation hit the sweet spot and that it wasn't kind of an overstep. He said that at the microphone, and then I followed him out into the hall, and you know, he put up his hand, he's like, wait, you know, he agreed to talk, but he's like, wait. And he finished writing his email, and he intimated that he was writing to Senate staffers in real time, shaping a bill that was before Congress. So, you know, at the same time this democratic deliberation was happening, the powers were functioning predictably in terms of setting up the actual legal apparatus. I think the pause is giving, you know, a chance for deliberation, and the appointment of people like Alondra Nelson in the White House in the United States gives me real hope that some concrete changes will happen at least there. But I think what we're going to see is a very fragmented, patchy landscape of national regulations, not international regulations that have any kind of binding legal mechanisms attached to them. Certain countries, I think, are going to be pushing ahead quite quickly. I think we can look to Israel to be one of those. There's already some interesting, you know, very proactive research going on there. And there's quite likely already quasi-illicit clinics that are offering this. So about a year and a half ago, I just typed in, you know, CRISPR IVF into Google, and I came up with a clinic in Cyprus that was offering this, an actual IVF clinic. And I reached out and I chatted with the guys on WeChat a little bit, or sorry, actually WhatsApp, I guess. And they wouldn't book me an appointment, but you know, the technique is not that difficult. So in the book, I talk about, you know, the expensive part is getting the IVF rig, and that's what a lot of clinics already have. And it basically just requires a little bit of extra, you know, reagents and pipettes, and one little machine that goes ping called an electroporator would, you know, that would be useful in some applications, but in others you don't even need an electroporator. The electroporator is the most expensive thing, and if you're trying to get it into multiple cells, that would be helpful. But if you're using ICSI, you know, injecting the sperm into the egg, you don't need an electroporator. So you're just, you know, designing a CRISPR, you're putting it into the cell and letting it do its work. And I should say, you know, kind of stepping back from the sensation, stepping back from the hope and hype, what I've really tried to do in the book is also kind of, in some ways, deflate CRISPR. You know, I talk about a lot of other tools, whether it's zinc fingers or lentiviruses, tools of genetic engineering that are basically doing the same thing. And I think that the stories that investors are telling about CRISPR, all the money that's being invested in it, you know, it could soon evaporate. You know, it's not a perfect tool. And in the book, and in fact, the title of the book comes from what CRISPR actually does. It generates targeted mutagenesis. In other words, that's damage. It's generating you know, we're all mutants, right? That's a basic fact of life. And it's, the book in many ways is a celebration of biological diversity. But yeah, CRISPR causes damage, and it's not an editing tool. It doesn't work that way. But I think what it is good at is diagnosing some problems and thinking about genetic determinism. You know, in the 90s, we were told about the sports gene and the gay gene and all these things. Turns out genetics is way more complicated than that. And at this point, making a change to the genome with CRISPR is more likely to cause harm than give any, you know, medical or enhanced benefit. Like, this is a lot of the conversation, particularly about eugenics, relates to these aspirations that have a long history of human enhancement. So turns out it's not that easy to do, even though those dreams are still pervasive. People are still hoping to create so-called designer babies.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I suppose there's some interesting parallels too with somatic cell nuclear transfer, which also wasn't hugely complicated, but has in many ways petered out in terms of human uses because, yeah, it didn't work out very well. So I know that there'll be lots of people wanting to ask you questions, and I want to make sure we have time for that. So I want to encourage people to put questions in the chat, and just looking to see if we have any. Yeah, so we are open for questions. We have a comment here, and interesting about race, whiteness, inequalities in cities that are centers of innovation in the global south. Drinking water has to be boiled in many Indian cities, and many homes still don't have proper toilets as well. Yes, definitely significant contrast that you draw at many points in the book between the sites of innovation and the very entrenched social inequality that continues to surround them in the United States as well as in Europe as well as China. So while we wait for people to put some other questions in, I did maybe want to just go back to the writing of the book question. I wonder if you've had some feedback from some of the people that you've spoken to in the book, and if they've had thoughts about the issues that you've raised in it, because you did speak to quite a few people that were very, very close to this, which is always a bit of another bit of an ethical question for the researcher. Yeah.
Yeah, when the book came out in the US back in November, I had some great events with some of the key protagonists in the story. So we haven't talked yet much about the HIV activists who were basically the first edited people, if you want to use that metaphor. So people talk about CRISPR doing editing. The metaphor actually originates with earlier experiments with zinc fingers, which basically do the same thing. They go into the DNA, they do a targeted break. You can be quite precise in terms of what part of the genome you break, but you can't always predict what damage emerges. So this community of HIV positive activists are alumni of ACT UP, this collective that emerged out of the AIDS crisis as people saw their friends, their loved ones die en masse. The mantra became drugs into bodies and silence equals death. And early in those days, there was a politics of antagonism where demands were made of the government, demands were made of companies to do different research, to do riskier research. They were like, we don't want the drugs that are available now. They have side effects. We want you to use our bodies to do these new risky experiments. So fast forward to 2008, 2010, a small company in San Francisco called Sangamo wants to test out these gene editing tools. And Matt Sharp is kind of the central protagonist in my story, someone who's signed up for 11 different clinical trials, who's been arrested like 8 times. And, Matt was excited about it. I asked him if he was afraid to be a guinea pig in this first in man experiment. And he was like, no, I had a thymus transplant back in 1991. They sort of cut open my chest and put this baby thymus in, and they wanted to see if it would make new T cells and help AIDS, and it didn't work, and there was a lot of blood and it was horrible. But yeah, this was just full of hope and full of promise. And Matt's story became one of struggle with the company that edited his DNA. Basically, it worked. Matt has, most people who are taking HIV medicine, their immune systems are fine now. But Matt is part of a group called immunological non-responders, and his immune system never recovered from the original AIDS diagnosis, and his cell counts have been hovering near AIDS ever since. So he wanted to see more of this gene therapy out in the clinic. So yeah, just sort of an aside to tell Matt's story. But yeah, we had some great events with Matt and Jay Johnson and Gregor Wolbring, a disabled theorist and scholar who's featured in the book. So yeah, it's been a lot of fun to kind of celebrate the book. And there's some people in the book who I haven't heard from, and I'm glad. You mentioned Michael Deem, who was Dr. Hu's PhD advisor, and who was in the room when the patients were signing the participant consent forms. He was a co-author on this paper to Nature. And Michael Deem was not charged by the Chinese government with any crime. There were two other members of the Chinese team who were charged with a crime, but Michael Deem wasn't. And basically the ethics committee of his university said that he did no wrong. And I come to a different conclusion in the book and sort of point out that we shouldn't be treating this one particular person as a rogue scientist when he was embedded in this very robust international network.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that. And I want to turn to some of the really great questions that are coming in, that are flooding in now. And the first.
And I'm just saying, I'm excited. Matt Sharp has just posted a comment. So, hey, Matt, I just told your story. You're here.
Yeah, no, he says thanks for the shout out. Yeah, no, he's posted. Also, just to say to everyone, I probably won't be able to get to all the questions before the end, but if it's okay with you, we can save the chat and give it to Eben, and he can then go on and get back to you on certain things if we don't cover all of them here. This is a very important question, which is to say, thank you for hiding the social justice implications here. In terms of the policy possibilities, there is an international treaty prohibiting heritable genome editing, the Oviedo Convention, which has force of law in the 29 European countries that have signed and ratified it. And based on a recent review, this questionnaire did published in the CRISPR journal, 75 countries in total prohibit it. Doesn't this suggest that broad international agreement is feasible? I'm concerned we're giving up on, that we are giving up way too easily on that.
So sure, and thank you, Marcy, for posting that and publishing that piece in the CRISPR journal. And I do think there are these possibilities of international alliances. I think there's so many complicated forces pushing, and so many concerns to be brought to bear on these questions. On the one hand, you have patient advocates, people with rare conditions, members of Congress even, who would love to see this in the clinic so that they can eliminate the BRCA gene from their germline. Even though now we know that the science of breast cancer is so much more complicated than a single gene, there are people who feel very strongly about this and who have a lot of power. And that's not to say we shouldn't give up. And I think, Marcy, in fact, right now is an excellent opportunity. And I would love to talk further. I just was meeting with someone from the Down syndrome community here in Australia yesterday. And, in many ways, these issues aren't new. These issues aren't necessarily about CRISPR and Imagine Futures. These are issues that people are already dealing with in the clinic. So some of the same issues that people who are using amniocentesis in the 80s or prenatal testing now in the clinic are very similar to the kinds of issues that we're thinking about if and when CRISPR is entering the clinic. So I think there's quite an opportunity right now for members of the disabled community, members of the queer community, social justice advocates, people who are advocating for equality in medicine, to not just legislate about uses of science after the technology has been developed, which is super important, and we should do more of that, but also get in the spaces where the future is being imagined, where companies are deciding which kinds of therapies to invest in. And this is where I think, again, Matt Sharp's struggle and some of his friends from ACT UP is a really excellent guide for the kinds of activism that we can be doing right now.
Yeah, and Matt Sharp adds that Sangamo has agreed to pay for long-term follow-up for the cohort. So that activism is continuing. Well done, Matt. Yeah. So here's another question, which is, I came in a bit late, so you may have covered this, but how are you using the word mutant? It sounds like a dangerous thing, but then you just said we're all mutants. also right now the notion of COVID mutating is causing us all angst. Like it can get more powerful. Can you comment on the word mutant and your use of it?
Yeah, and interestingly, there was just a piece in the Wall Street Journal that sort of played with the idea of mutant in the context of the COVID strains. And maybe just talking about COVID in particular, I'm doing a new project right now on virology, and I'm writing a long, slow book about the pandemic. And I'm not too concerned about all the variants in conversation with virologists that are circulating now. But yeah, like many other viruses, the coronavirus is constantly mutating, and some virologists talk about it not as a stable species, but as a mutant swarm. And mutant is one way of talking about biological diversity. Again, we are all born with from 40 to 80 mutations that make us distinct from our parents. By the time you're middle-aged like me, you've got anywhere from 4,000 to 6,000 mutations in a given cell. And by using this word in the title, it was meant to invoke some of these earlier science fiction stories. The X-Men. The X-Men is a parable in many ways about science and justice. If you watch the first movie, it opens in Auschwitz, where this young boy is being torn away from his parents. Fast forward, it's the supervillain Magneto. And the story for the X-Men is one where biological diversity and special ability is sort of demonized and stigmatized. And with a tool like CRISPR, first of all, that's what it does on a molecular level. It generates mutagenesis. But it could also be used to homogenize the human species. It could be used to eliminate difference and diversity. And if we can make some decisions about the future gene pool, should we? Should we all aspire to be the same? So I basically conclude on a note that suggests that we could use this to induce new kinds of biological diversity, kinds of biological diversity that haven't yet been imagined. So for me, the idea of the mutant is a playful one and invites us to think about norms and normality as much about possibility.
So I have a question. I'm not quite sure I entirely follow the question, but I'll ask you the question, and maybe the questioner can clarify the question if it's not clear. But the questioner is asking, do you worry about political fluidity with regard to the future of CRISPR? And if so, is this just from the perspective of social political justice, or also from the point of view of scientific developments?
I'm also not entirely sure I understand political fluidity, but I guess for me, I think about politics as fluid. My first book is about a social justice movement in New Guinea. And, there I saw a movement very able to respond to contingencies. So this is in a condition of genocide. It's a story about West Papua, a Black power struggle where indigenous folks are trying to get freedom from a neo-colonial situation. And there I found, at different political moments, the movement was able to respond and identify new targets for activism and advocacy. When a given strategy didn't work, they would try out something else. And even when the thing that they hoped for happened, sometimes we pin our hopes on the arrival of, a messiah or the departure of a dictator. Donald Trump is gone. The world is going to be great again. But often in those moments of seeming revolutionary change, that's a profoundly disappointing moment when all the hopes that you've held on to don't arrive. So I guess for me, politics is fluid, and it's about doing that careful work of identifying what's worth hoping for, what's beautiful against the ugly. I think in situations of injustice, it's easier to see the injustice sometimes than when justice arrives. So yes, I think politics is fluid, and I think we have to be nimble as we're thinking about future possibilities.
Well, cleverly, I think you've also answered the other two questions that person has asked, which I hope the questioner agrees with. I'm just going to ask a question from the question and answer, because there's question and answer as well as chat. And this is a very, this is a question I think a lot of people are going to want to know the answer to, which is, why did you choose to work on this topic in the first place?
Actually, the fault of a friend. So I was teaching at Princeton. I just finished my last book, Emerging Ecologies, and the summit was happening. I hadn't heard about it, and it's someone who shows up in the book, Adam Zaratsky, and someone who I've written about before. Adam Zaratsky is an artist who is in the book. I describe him as the one who's wanting to create a genetically modified child as a work of art, and Adam's a peculiar character. I mean, he's working in the shock art tradition, and on the one hand, you can see what Adam does as deeply troubling, but his work is all about catalyzing these ethical confrontations and ethical dialogues. So Adam told me that there's a summit happening. He somehow scored me an invite. We all went down to the National Academies of Science, and I sat through all these lectures, and there was a lot of talk about the promise of CRISPR. But at that moment, I really decided, like, I don't want to study. I was interested in the speculation and in the hope and the hype attached to CRISPR. And Sarah saw, I think, an early essay that looked at that. But I also decided, as an ethnographer, I'm more interested in the science that's already happened. So that's when I started digging into the Sangamo story, into the zinc finger story. So it just kind of unfolded from there, and I just followed the scientists, followed the activists, followed the patients, followed the controversy as it unfolded. And I thought my book was done when I went to Hong Kong. I had a book that was done, and then the Dr. He story happened, and I just so happened to get kind of insider access to some of the documents in the lab, so that radically changed the horizons of the book project.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you very much. We're don't have a lot of time left, but there's one question here that I also think a lot of people will be very interested to hear you speak about, which is drawing in the questions of researching, writing, and ethics. How did you negotiate ethics in all these different research sites? How well did research ethics keep up with the pace of your research when you don't always know what the sites are going to be in advance?
Yeah, so I guess, like Karen Barad, I think about ethics as relation and responsibility as sort of ongoing interaction. So there's, as social scientists, we're asked to perform to committees where, we complete some paperwork, and that kind of deems whether or not this is ethical. And in the project, I'm kind of getting inside and exploring some of this paperwork that really produced a failing. The paperwork that I showed at the very beginning of the talk, where they're asking for consent to take the picture of the child, and all these other contractual languages, I think eclipse the horizons of ethical possibility in research. So ethics can also be antagonistic. I think, thinking with, and this is getting academic, but, thinkers like Chantal Mouffe and Ernesto Laclau talk about how sort of antagonism can generate the kinds of conflicts that produce political and, I would say, ethical possibilities. Working with other thinkers like Isabel Stingers, maybe the job of ethics is to produce better conflicts rather than a sense of final peace. So, there's a lot of ethical projects that are about shutting down ethical discussion, like a lot of idioms of ethics or practices of ethics or ways that ethics is performed are trying to limit the conversation about ethics. But I think, in these more relational settings and settings where you have ongoing conversations, I think that's where the interesting discussions can happen to kind of unsettle, some of the paperwork and think about ethics in a more expansive way.
Yeah. Well, that's a very thoughtful place to wrap up our discussion, and I certainly think that you carry that sense of responsibility and that sense of sort of provocative pushing in order to see what kinds of responsibilities we have throughout the book. And yeah, I definitely recommend people to use your 50% discount and get a copy of this very important book, this very unusual book. I really haven't read a book like this before, and I look forward very much to the many sequels of this from you, Evan. And thank you very much for getting up at the crack of dawn in Australia to join us over here in England.
Thanks so much, Sarah.
Thank you, everyone who's attended as well. And we'll be winding up shortly, but thank you also to Bristol University Press and to Catherine for hosting us. And I'll just pass it over to you, Catherine, for the final word.
And I might just say, I also want to give a shout out to all the friends and colleagues who've shown up and posted in the chat. So thank you, Matt, Emma, Marcy, really good to see you on here.
Yeah, and thank you, Eben. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, both Sarah and Eben. That was a really fascinating, interesting. It felt like it was eavesdropping on a private conversation between you, which was absolutely fantastic. And thank you to everyone for joining us today at this online launch. Details of how to order the UK edition of Eben's book, published by Bristol University Press at 50% discount by using the code MUTANT50. Details available in the chat. Please see our social media or website for details of our next events. And thank you again very much for joining us today.